All right, can I confirm? All right. Can I confirm that I'm audible loud and clear? Great. If at any point in time I'm not, you can just put it in the chat and I'll try to be louder. Um, but okay, cool. Just give me 10 seconds to. Hmm. All right, cool. Starting in three, two, one. Banos, South Korea and Japan just happen to be two countries that sure have had past disputes, but they're two countries regardless that have had access to similar resources, require the same resources technologically, militarily, even just in terms of food and just resources, instead of creating a symbiotic relationship that helps them manage these resources in a manner that both of them can get access to it. If we show you in this debate why a diplomatic relationship that furthers these diplomatic ties as well as economic ties is better for both of these nations, we stand to win this debate. I'd also rather posit that opposition is likely to lack an alternative into solving the kind of current tensions that exist between Japan and South Korea. Note that we concede that there is some sort of form of tension, so we're trying to resolve this tension, and how this resolve is crucially important to note on our side of the house. So first things first, a couple pieces of characterization. One, I think in terms of what this sort of diplomatic ties and economic ties are going to look into. I think this is largely going to be a gradual easing into these ties, wherein firstly you set up whole diplomatic talks, you have a couple of summits that try to strengthen and pursue free trade agreements. You have probably moving into combined military deals within like technological companies that are common in both of these nations. Further developments of like infrastructure that can probably happen, but also like more in agreements within trade and how you're using the common resources that you have to yourselves. So first things first, with regards to what these arguments are going to be, first we're just going to explain to you what the economic benefits are going to be of this kind of agreement, what the military benefits are going to be, and thirdly, we're largely going to compare like things like how you're in a better position to also resolve past disputes, as well as other miscellaneous things like climate change goals. So first things first, I think with regards to economic stuff, one, both of these countries come from a largely technological advanced background that has helped these countries go from developing nations to also be established as developed nations. This looks like semiconductor chips and like establishment of other companies like Toshiba and like Toshiba, Samsung, and all of these companies. So insofar as you're also fighting against other Southeast Asian countries like China in the semiconductor and like other technological advancements, also as well as USA, I think it's probably important for these countries to ally together insofar as they can share these kind of technological resources, understand the kind of research that goes on in the technological advancements, but also share the kind of outputs that they're creating. This allows them to have some form of manufacturing exchange. The second thing is with regards to free trade agreements. This shows like how you can probably invest in the Japanese market because of two reasons. One, Japan market currently has negative interest rates. So this negative interest rates kind of encourage spending because it's probably easier and cheaper for people to want to invest in these markets. This looks like markets along further technological companies and all these kind of things. Third, you allow for labor pool exchange. This is easier to do when you have better diplomatic ties as opposed to immigrant restrictions. When these restrictions sort of ease up, you can also have better labor pool exchange. This looks like important for two reasons. One, both of these countries have an aging population, which means their working force members are largely low. So insofar as you both lack these in number, you can probably have some form of exchange benefit. So you have better exchange of skilled labor going in and out of these countries. But secondly, this is probably likely to happen anyway because you want to have more jobs created for you. But we just make this easier considering that there is some sort of tensions that can probably exist. The fourth thing is in terms of why this economic trade agreements is going to be better for a couple of interests in terms of food and land interests, right? Because note, the kind of ways that they're probably growing foods in terms of rice and other sort of grains and other sort of vegetables is also used in common forms of land. But also, secondly, the kind of way they're like sourcing out for seafood is also from like the same common sea. So, insofar as both of these things are common, a large number of times because there's lack of trust in terms of whether one would try to fight the other out in this fight for resources, there's previously been restrictions, right? So Japan tries to restrict South Korea, South Korea tries to restrict Japan, just to ensure that they can both access the resources as much as they need to. In the absence of these restrictions, what then happens with better diplomatic ties is you're more likely to pursue common interests and figure out like how you can both get access to resources necessarily without having to restrict each other out. These restrictions in the past have caused other economic backlashes and like backdrops from the economic perspective, also just harming in how you can access these resources. A lot of people in rural Japan and rural South Korea then start to like lack the access to food and other sort of things. So insofar as there's a tragedy of commons, insofar as you have common interests, it's important to pursue a symbiotic relationship, because in the absence of this symbiotic relationship, it's likely that you're likely to end up lobby these out and figure these out and have similar agreements on them instead of having to like work on restrictions. The second thing is with regards to military advancements, right? Because note, the Japanese army has had precedences for being strong with regards to having access to nuclear technology, having highly skilled and trained soldiers, and all these kind of things. Why is this important? Because South Korea technically faces two kinds of threats. One, threat from North Korea within the land borders, so even generating minimal amount of leverage with regards to just the threat of sort of attacking South Korea could be impeccable for even North Korea to do so, considering they also have Japan on their side of the house. But B, in regards to like China in the waters, so when you have like the South China Sea disputes, just having more ability and more military that you can have to counter the Chinese ships that will threaten South Korean as well is an important thing that you can have. The reason that this necessarily works is that it's not just South Korean military. Maybe you probably wouldn't go ahead and use military force, but it's still a good thing to be allied with a strong military force such that you can show that you're not a country that is to be messed with because you have a strong military ally as well. Thirdly and lastly, in terms of the better position to resolve past disputes and why that is likely to happen. Additionally, also like climate change goals. Note that both of these countries are reducing the climate change pollution and all these things. Considering that both of them are developed nations and also want to pursue further technological advancement and other forms of growth, it's important that their kind of growth doesn't come at the cost of like reducing the climate or like harming the environment for either of these areas. So considering that both of them use similar areas for their growth, it's important to ensure that neither of these is environmentally damaging. This can be done insofar as you have diplomatic relations. You can probably come on agreements and policies in terms of what your future climate change goals will be, how you're going to pursue, and what your environmental sort of policies will be as well. But lastly, in terms of why you're probably in a better position to resolve past disputes, I want to posit that it's probably true that a large chunk of the current generations don't have direct trauma from whatever has happened in the past with regards to Japan colonizing South Korea. So even if there's some kind of issues that are happening and there's some sort of disinterest, it's probably because Japan hasn't quite addressed the past issues. The only reason that you're able to do this on our end of the house is because you initiate a diplomatic front. On opposition side, you initiate an aggressive front where you're probably in an argumentative role, as opposed to a discussion where you're probably more like charitable towards each other and try to have a discussion that leads to good resolutions, as opposed to a discussion that is meaningfully for the purpose of trying to bring the other nation down and all these kind of things. So when you're in the diplomatic relation, you have the better position to come to resolving these past disputes, insofar as you can have a ground of discussion to talk about these things. So what have we shown to you in this debate, right? Three things. One, in terms of why you're more likely to improve the past relations and why you're able to get economic benefits to military benefits. Also just common goals in terms of being able to use common resources and why you're more likely better on these fronts. Couldn't be more proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the first affirmative speaker for that speech and welcome the first negative speaker to begin negative's case.
Hi, audible and visible? Okay, pronouns are he, him. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Hi is a good, it's good case. Notice that things like labor, military or technology exchange or trade will still exist in every single trade agreement that you make with every other country in the world. And in as much as South Korea already has, number one, like minute economic ties with Japan that already exists, and other economic and diplomatic ties with other countries in the world, then those benefits like shared labor, shared technology, shared military will still exist in our world anyways. There's no nuance on their side to talk about why we have to pursue this with Japan necessarily and nuance it on Japan itself. And in as much as that's how First Affirmative already set up their case, we think that this is damning for the whole setup on their bench. First thing that I question on their side is how are they fighting for the resources? Because that's what First Affirmative talked about. There's no structural reason to show why and how they're fighting for scarce resources, and they haven't talked about what those resources are. Anyways, the next thing they talked about is they want to resolve the tension, and they say that they do resolve the tension in the minute that they pursue, for example, the economic ties. But notice how the motion is worded, right? The motion is it's like South Korea is the actor of the motion, so we imply that it is South Korea that actively wants to create a tie with Japan. Therefore, we're going to go out of our way, make concessions, for example, and make compromises with, for example, tension and to act, for example, to get their ties. Chances are we will be shortchanged. We're the ones who will have to create, like compromises, etc., 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 etc. Next thing they say is we have to share tech resources. They talked about tech and semiconductors, right? But in as much as semiconductors are only produced in Taiwan, we question the necessity of having to share these resources with Japan. They're probably going to get it either ways. Last thing that they talked about are border conflicts. We say that the border conflict that exists in South Korea is already demilitarized, so that means that there is an agreement with North and South Korea to not create any conflicts. And in the worst case, we do have military resources from our local reserves, but also from the shit ton of American bases that exist in South Korea already. I don't see why it's important for us to have military connections with Japan for us to be seen as a threat. We literally have the best military of the world in our own country. Anyways, lastly on just SDGs, we think SDGs are an international effort. So on the other side, they're still going to pursue SDGs. I don't see how that's an important case for them to run. How am I then going to set up this debate, right? Because what does it mean to actively pursue a close economic and diplomatic tie with Japan? And assuming that South Korea is the actor for this debate, we assume that this is central to what they're going to do. We think that what has to happen here in order for this to happen is we have to make major concessions about previous disagreements with Japan, i.e., giving up on making a scene in the international level and holding Japan accountable for their war crimes and other misgivings, etc., etc. In as much as you want to appease Japan, right, and to create this economic tie with them, you have to do this because it's you who has to go out of your way, for example, to make this thing happen with them. But second, you also this is how you make things amicable with them. I'm going to give structural reasons why this has to be the case. What are we okay with then? Number one, we're okay with just keeping the minimal ties that already exist. We're okay with building economic ties with other states as well. We think that's status quo, and we're going to defend that. First definition then is that there's an ongoing trade war between Japan and whitelist in 2019, right? This is because South Korea has been accused of violating the UN Convention for secretly trading with North Korea. But second, this definition is important because the active incentives of South Korea don't have positive views on Japan. Therefore, the burden on AF side is to prove why this is so important for us to ignore years of cultural and economic. Second thing is that South Korea is already an economically strong, and they already have economically strong country, and already have ties with Japan anyways. They house some of the world's biggest tech companies. They have immense soft power due to their billion-dollar entertainment industry, and that leads to tourism and stuff like that. And they have good military due to demilitarization and the fact that they have joint military agreements with the United States. They have existing ties with other countries as well. What this definition means is they can stand on their own regardless of creating more economic ties with Japan or not. Therefore, AF has to prove why this is so important for us to do. If we prove that South Korea has active disincentives to work against this policy, and why pursuing this will be extremely harmful for South Korea, and why they have more relevant problems internally, then we win this debate, right? First argument I'll talk about is South Korea has more important problems to deal with right now, and pursuing these ties exacerbates those problems that exist. Why is it the case? What's the trade-off here? Why can only do one of the two? Because actively pursuing means that you dedicate a lot of state resources towards making this tie happen. This means that you allocate a lot of negotiating tables, capital for policy making, etc., etc., towards making this deal. Other reasons as to why I can only do this policy and not other things, like, because of the amount of resources you allocate to this and like diametrical opposition and things like that. What are the problems then that we want to solve and gets exacerbated on their side? We think there's a chaebol problem that exists with South Korea. Chaebols are like mega corporations that are so rich and so big that they have become political entities themselves. This means that they have a handful of politicians in their pocket to sway policies in their benefit. That means pushing for deregulation, for example, and more neoliberal stuff, etc., etc. This problem creates an endless cycle of dependency on these chaebols and warehouses of the country. This exacerbates the problem of Korea because pursuing these economic ties means you lessen the capacity to regulate them because they ought to perform stronger than they already do, which leads to like this last fair, for example, capitalist system that already exists. And first, these ties with the chaebol problem still existing means that you give more resources to expand the reach in your country. This makes your dependency on them so much worse because they're so big, they're so important, you can't just live without them. So third, that will exist with Japan. The president dictates the political direction of every foreign connection that they have, right? Since the president right now is ultra conservative and nationalistic, as relevant, for example, when they repealed the rights to women, reproductive rights, for example, etc., etc. They're nationalistic and conservative. Anyway, what does this mean? That means that they care about their national identity and making that national identity known to everyone else. We are better able to solve the chaebol problem because the conservative president doesn't like the fact that these chaebol companies act in a very liberal manner, right? That means we get to solve this because we give more political attention to regulating these companies, for example, putting them onto hold, lessening their power, for example, in politics, in order to make politics more conservative, etc., etc. That's the solvency here. Second argument then, on how we exacerbate the cultural instability between the two countries. And that's how half doesn't get their case here. And since it's conservative, this means that the majority holds the same pool of concerns, i.e. nationalism, conservatism, etc., etc. Being conservative means that there's an increased concern in the unadulterated national identity of the country, just like how Japan wants to be ultra-nationalist and ultra-conservative as well, right? And the next thing I'll talk about is there are past cultural conflicts that already exist between the two states that lead to hard feelings between the two. What are these? The fact that Japan has committed several war crimes against South Korea during World War II. This is still all the more relevant in the modern world when we see a cultural pool to hold these people into account, i.e. South Korea still talks a lot about the horrors of comfort women, for example, in the modern day. So the general tone in Japan is still angry. It's just hammered by the fact that Japan has actively denied and refused to apologize and hold themselves accountable for the things that they've done in the war. So if you want to pursue the ties, that means you have to let go of this push to hold themselves accountable for these things. The last thing I'll talk about is that the president has consolidated power from the fact that he's conservative and carries the national sentiment of Korea. Therefore, if you want to pursue the economic ties, you let go of the president's consolidation of the conservative power, the conservative sentiment that he holds, for example, in those things. Therefore, at the end of the day, you don't get to solve the ties, the problems that exist between you and Japan. You don't get more economic benefit, or it's not important because you're quite powerful and you have ties with other countries anyway. Affirmative has to prove necessity on their end. This is a clear negative ballot already from the first exchange.
I'd like to thank the first negative speaker for that speech and welcome second affirmative to continue the team's case.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, just give me a few seconds. All right, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. They mainly have two pushes. The first push is that you can do one thing only, which is like dealing with the companies or making relationship ties. I want to just point out how ridiculous this point is, right? Like literally think about every single country in the world who works on multiple issues at multiple points of time. Like India has a domestic economy which is necessarily wants to care about, which means that they necessarily want to make policies which they want more domesticated companies to come up and break those monopolies. But at the same point of time, they're pursuing relations with Russia, China, and so on. Which means that their international relations front of the South Korean government drastically works very differently than their own domestic policies, right? They're literally two different departments of the fucking government, extremely unsure why exactly is that a binary. They never explain it to you. They just say that these companies necessarily have political power and so on, and China Korea wants to deal with this. Extremely unsure how that is relevant to the motion and how exactly dealing with Japan necessarily makes this company either more powerful or so on. But secondly, and more importantly, right, if you really want to deal with these companies, the problem is that they have been monopolistic in South Korean market itself, because South Korean businesses necessarily are not able to outcompete them. The only way you make these markets non-monopolistic or these companies non-monopolistic is by allowing Japanese companies to come into South Korea and establish their own businesses, right? That's the only way you can necessarily outcompete these monopolies which are necessarily affecting you politically. So on that regard as well, we are more likely to win because we are more able to encourage Japanese investment and Japanese companies setting up their plants and everything else in South Korean economy as well. The point at which we have eased off tensions, I think at that point of time, they necessarily have to deal with that. They have to just be like, I think that's absolutely irrelevant in this debate. But secondly, and more importantly, right, tensions. What do they tell you? They tell you there is past trauma in terms of Japan doing war crimes and so on. Right? They never tell you how exactly two things, right? How Japan acknowledges that they have done war crimes, which quote unquote they already have, but also more importantly, how exactly they get reparations on their side or any sort of victim closure. We tell you the only way you can get some sort of victim closure is by directly talking to Japan. The only way you ask for that, hey, we want to make better relations with you, the only thing which you need to do is to at least apologize for whatever you have done. This is not something we are making up. This has been already tried in 2017 when Shinzo Abe literally apologized for whatever has happened to Korean citizens in Japanese borders. I think at that point of paradigm, the only way you necessarily get any sort of victim closure is by talking to Japan directly. But also more importantly, right, like I'm extremely unsure how this past trauma is something which is relevant, but more importantly, if this would have been, no countries would have ever dealt or any sort of free trade agreement with any sort of Western country, right? Let's say like India and UK would have never traded because British colonized India for far too long. I think people are able to move away from this trauma more importantly because they see economic and military interest and because they see there are benefits in terms of them getting more jobs, but also more importantly, them being economically stable. Extremely unsure how past trauma becomes a tipping point. But also more importantly, the comparative, even if you have to judge this past trauma argument, is by seeing that where exactly it eases off. Because the most important things about past trauma is not holding them on as a part of your own cultural identity, but rather solving them, rather having some sort of mechanization in which you necessarily get closure for what exactly has happened to you. That can only happen when you're not at odds with each other, not having trade wars with each other. At a point at which you are allies, you necessarily look into how exactly you can resolve this trauma so that both of the countries can have a better future. I think at that point of paradigm, we have much more mechanized in terms of how you can exactly deal with the past trauma generally have. What is our case and why their engagement is absolutely horrific? Like we already have economic ties with Japan. Like if that is true, why am I debating this motion? But more importantly, they have economic ties with other countries. We tell that's not important because like better economic ties with an additional country like Japan, which is already pretty fucking developed, just brings more and more amount of revenue to Korea if you have free trade agreements. But more importantly, the idea is really simple. When Korea and Japan necessarily go into trade war, that helps literally no one, right? Which is to say that these countries have economies developed upon the idea of technological advancement. The moment you have trade wars with each other, we are trying to outcompete with each other, you're necessarily ensuring that you necessarily have lesser allies for you to sell. But also more importantly, at a point at which you're putting restrictions on each other. For example, raw materials which Korea has putting restriction on Japan. Similarly, if Japan puts it on Korea, it makes your products more and more expensive on the Korean side and the Japanese side as well. Why this is tremendously bad, right? Because this allows other actors which are around Asian countries, something like China and Taiwan, to make sure that they are making this technology way cheaper than you are. So this trade war necessarily affects you more often than not because you are more importantly dependent upon technologically advanced economies, right? I think at that point of paradigm, you are necessarily dependent upon each other to remove this kind of trade restrictions and to avoid that trade war. So which trade war they necessarily want to talk about literally harms Korea more than anything else. So it's best it is to remove those kind of trade wars. I think that's the most important comparative in this debate. What does this show to you? That the impact of this is that you get a sustainable Korean economy. The way you can probably confirm sustainability of the Korean economy is by a few things. A, you're not getting outcompeted by other businesses in your best possible way of making money, which is technological advancement, right? But also more more importantly, the idea of tragedy of commons, which Chesta only talks about, no engagement with this, right? Like you're sourcing technological raw materials from the same source, but also more importantly, your fishing industry is dependent upon the similar seas, right? And upon which you do not restrict each other, you necessarily have more control over how exactly you're using these resources and not making sure that they're literally going away. All of those necessarily means that Japan is the unique actor who can do this, because no other trade ally is necessarily involved in a way in which Japan is. Secondly, military. They look at the engagement with this argument, right? North Korea has demilitarized. I mean, sure, like you can trust Kim Jong-un to be diplomatic as fuck and be a reasonable person. I'm extremely unsure why that's likely to be true, right? After demilitarization, North Korea there have been missile strikes around South Korea, and these are suspected to be North Korean missiles, right? All of those means that there is military tension which already perpetuates between these borders. Why allying with Japan is tremendously important, because even if like I don't know why South Korean military is the best military in the world, but even if it is, more amount of military resources just creates better deterrence. Whole military strategy around the South China Sea and the border is dependent upon a few things. What Japan can give you is more amount of nautical miles, which is to say that Japan's nautical miles you can necessarily south away from their sea rather than allowing them to go into it. But more importantly, Japan has better amount of nuclear technologies with them, weapons are army, which just creates your arsenal more and more. Why this is tremendously important in this debate? Because this that you're getting rid of the common security threat which is there. Note, this is relationship which is tremendously symbiotic, right? Which is to say you necessarily cannot assert that Japan would like probably want to wait for more amount of assertions, more amount of waiting for concessions, right? Because like Japan really wants its citizens to spend more and more amount of money, which means it wants Korean citizens to come back, which means that they do not need concessions to do this. But secondly, and more importantly, the threat which we are talking about in terms of China, literally Japan faces the same threat in the South China Sea, which means that it has common military interests, right? We say that this directly helps Japan as well. What does this prove to you? This proves to you that this means that they necessarily pursue common security interests, which means that Korean security itself is held, and Japan is the unique actor who can do that because of the fact of the military advances it has, but more importantly, Japanese location, which allows them to have nautical miles to deal with Chinese submarines which are moving in South China Sea. Panel, we stand to win this debate because we are the only one who are able to solve any sort of past tensions and past trauma these both countries have. But secondly, and more importantly, their comparative doesn't exist. But thirdly, we have the standalone economic and military interests, which are necessarily held.
I'd like to thank Second Affirmative for that speech and welcome Second Negative to continue the negative team's case.
Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There are a few things that we can derive from the previous speaker. 1, their matter is wrong. 2, their understanding of demilitarization among Korean states is wrong. They're demilitarized. Firstly, let's clarify this because I'm really annoyed. In the demilitarized zone, that is to say, there is a strip of land between North Korea and South Korea where there's a in perpetuity ceasefire that is applied. That does not mean, however, that these countries can no longer just start war with each other again. But secondly, I do not know where proposition is getting their matter. I literally have a friend in Japan who conducted a research paper on this. The Japanese government's efforts to deny things such as war crimes extend to the historical revisionism of their own textbooks. Like 90% of the textbooks that Japanese school children engage in never mention the words comfort women, never mention the words like Shangjing massacre or something. Shinzo Abe straight up apologizing to South Korea is a straight up lie. Google it after the debate. They are completely false in that matter. Proposition has 2 unique benefits here. 1, economic and military. 2, resolving other disputes. Firstly, dealing with economic and military benefits. Firstly, they tell us that because of both these countries have technological interests, this instantaneously means that South Korea should drop everything and work together by easing into these ties and having some deals made. Okay, I'm engaging with their frame, very generous here, right? Notice that unique burden of proposition at this point in time is close diplomatic and economic ties with Japan. They do not nuance anything to this word close. All you can get from them is basically just having existing diplomatic and economic ties. They do not explain why existing ties are not enough. This necessarily means that they had to prove a unique benefit to pursuing such ties with Japan. While DPM does try to do this, the argument at PM is that they do nothing here. All their benefits are probably symmetric, given that we can just name a different but similar country and get all of them. Propositions can't win on their own metrics. Secondly, DPM then tells us you get a sustainable Korean economy because you're not out competing yourself or running into the tragedy of commons. First, I want to congratulate them for finally providing a nuance. The second primary benefit they try to get is we have the ability to resolve disputes. I'll respond to this on 3 levels. Firstly, they said that the Japanese army is strong because South Korea is under threat from North Korea. Makes sense. The problem is that it still does not explain why you need specifically Japan. No nuance here. Insofar as you can probably ally with countries like Taiwan or Singapore, who have the respectable standing militaries of their own. Not sure why you would want to like ally with Japan, who after World War II literally had its military crippled and is continually enforced year by year to make sure it meets a maximum number. By the way, there are like inspectors that come into Japan to make sure that they have a military that does not exceed the size. Not sure why the active incentive for a strong military force exists with Japan. Secondly, they thought sustainable development goals are really nice. I think that's a reach. Proposition wants to solve every structural problem from poverty to world hunger that exists by negotiating with the country that you hate. Thirdly, they said that you're in a better position to resolve past disputes. Finally, one-dimensional, as if you can only hold one country to account for decades of political turmoil. Even if this was something that was proven to be inherently valuable, there was nothing done to prove the unique mechanistic value of negotiating with Japan yourself versus having an intermediate media do it for you. I'm reading sides about have the United States. I'm not sure if Japan has nukes, but the US definitely does. And the US has the most nukes in the world. Why do you need 3 more nukes if Japan has them when access to the US defense systems is a symmetric characterization given mechanisms such as defense treaties, UN, or literally any other country that is proximate to South Korea? My entire extension is going to be focused on the idea of when do you pursue close economic relationships and diplomatic ties with the country. First, let's deal with this nuancing of news before I properly move on to the nuancing of close before I properly move on to my case. The difference between close and something that is like a general economic relationship is that you as a state have to put and divert a significant amount of resources time, which is why India can do it. Yeah, because they aren't pursuing close relationships with these states. They are pursuing relationships with these states. The nuancing of close then has to be applied to this idea of you have to divert a significant amount of resource to it. Because countries only have so many resources to go around in terms of political capital and economic financing, the close probably means, oh, there's a limitation what they are able to accomplish. 2 levels then on why you pursue close and relationships in the first place. The first part on why you do this or why you would do this in the first place is when you have an equal ability to negotiate. An equal ability to negotiate is dependent on factors such as having similar interest in outcomes. They didn't prove that Japan has this. Comparable resources, they don't prove that this exists. And a mutual want to achieve the conclusion. Again, this is entirely damaging. I'll prove why that's one of the most important things that Proposition fails on later. This is necessary for several reasons. It includes having balanced negotiations. Obviously, no one wants to go through a process wherein you are probably disadvantaged. But secondly, having an equal ability to negotiate is more likely to lead to positive outcomes insofar as parties are happy and agreeable to the kinds of negotiations that take place. This is not the case within the debate. This is because Japan has resources that South Korea requires, and this relationship is unique because these resources come in the forms of things such as industrial chemicals. The importance of these resources is that they happen to supply the tech industry. How important is the tech industry in South Korea? You can't simply brush it off with these resources held over your head. Even if it's like increments over time, it's not something you can afford to negotiate in good faith. Proposition can't just say that they'll get them from other places because Japan is a majority and unique producer of these chemicals. Even if they started expanding where they got them from, it's not enough to recoup the losses of Japan withholding these. It becomes a form of strategic coercion. If Proposition says South Korea can also do this, I tell them to name one thing that South Korea is unique in producing that other countries cannot provide in equal or large months. What are the incentives for this to happen? Basically, Japan has, to politely put it, a distaste for South Korea and distaste both in economic, cultural, and political perspective. This probably means that in times when negotiations that allow them a better shot of coming out on top will most likely be utilized, i.e. this foreign coercion I just discussed. Even if the negotiation is successful on Proposition side, right? Why is it probably still terrible? Because of the fact that both sides are probably trying to negotiate in bad faith, on the reason that both of them have always be a country that comes out less happy. Insofar as Proposition cannot guarantee that in majority of cases, South Korea will not come out on top, it is not worth it to pursue this policy. Second level of analysis. You pursue close and economic and political ties with countries when there's an overwhelming incentive to do this despite mitigatory factors. Given South Korea's status as a democratic state, right? I'll posit that, like my first speaker says, there are so many things that South Korea as a state is justified in prioritizing, has better incentives in terms of pursuing. This can look like internal issues such as the chaebols becoming toxic but necessary parts of their society. This can be focusing on their own agricultural sector. This can be making trade deals with China. All of this serves to show the reality. South Korea probably does not need Japan dictating an active debate. It is implicitly important to discuss the incentives and priorities of South Korea at this time. What do these look like? My first speaker already told you about them. Proposition's general trade deal case does not work here. What proposition thus far is failing on is proving why Japan would want to do this. Because there has to be a degree of reciprocation here, panel. This is because of my first speaker's analysis of things like cultural and long-standing political conflict. This was probably parallelized on the side of Japan as well. The entirety of their case hinges upon the assumption that Japan will also want to reciprocate and want to hold hands, sing kumbaya, and have bygones be bygones. What does this mean in terms of overwhelming incentive? There is no overwhelming incentive that is unique to pursuing close diplomatic deals with Japan. Proposition insofar they have not given analysis and they can't give any more analysis at WIP to prove why Japan would want to do this mutually with you, and apparently
I thank the second negative speaker for that speech and welcome third affirmative to close the substantive portion of affirmative's case. And because third affirmative does not consent to streaming, I've also paused the recording.
Okay. Thank you.
Please check. I'll just find my hair because it's really hot. I'm just going to leave the meeting in another device so it won't have. Give it a sec. Sorry. Great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. In an after motion, I'd note that what adjudicators has to judge this debate is whether themes have proved that a certain argument is A, within the incentive of X actor to pursue, but secondly, that it's within the interest of X actor to have. In this speech, I'll prove to you why. First, the active pursuit is not necessary in the first place, and it's likely that if we do this, it's going to harm South Korea and delay its priorities as a country. But before that, I just like to clarify, right, what AF's case is merely about. Their main banner cry is that we're already in a very good state. Let's be better. Yay. The problem with this is that it doesn't engage to the multiple nuanced argument we forward, i.e., that there is a need to improve internal stability precisely because the chaebols are encroaching the political sphere. That's likely going to create more harms at the point that we do this. What does pursuing a close tie look like? I don't know what government only debates in is the pursuit of the tie. We tell you at first that pursuing close tie probably looks like South Korea making large compromises. So while it's true that you make compromises on both ends if you negotiate, at a point in time that you want to make it close, it's likely to make large compromises as a country. Things that probably don't benefit you, but because you want the tie, you likely do this in the first place. But it's also looked like South Korea not asking for an apology from Japan because they know that this is a form of tension. Therefore, they likely to ignore this and skirt this, and therefore that likely leads to more harm. Both shows that there is a dependency that happens. What happens, therefore, on their side is what you have to weigh this dependency, therefore, is the extent of dependency that happens inside affirmative. But before the issues, let's have an extremist rebuttal, right? Note that third affirmative argues that if South Korea is already good, then there's no harm in being better. This ignores the analysis that came from Neg's two counters constructive speaker. We talk about the economic costs of worsening the internal problems and failing to hold Japan accountable. Even if you don't get reparations, recognition is enough, much better than status quo. First issue, is the active pursuit necessary? We told you at first that South Korea is already a powerhouse in the global stage. First, they house one of the biggest tech companies in the global scenario, and therefore they're likely to be rich. They have a strong entertainment industries. They have developed military precisely because they understand that there is a tendency for North Korea to attack and like cause conflict. Therefore, and this area is already rich and it's already strong. If resources is a problem, know that they can just outsource it out from developing countries in the East Asia and Southeast Asia. The problem of opposition, of affirmative, is that they never tell us why in pursuit of the close tie resolves this in the first place. Their mere argument here is that, well, they will cooperate with each other when they do this. But no panel, they never told us why the distribution are likely to be equal. If it's true that resources are limited already, I'd flip this argument and suggest that it's likely one of the conflicting points of South Korea and Japan, precisely because there has been existing trade wars between these countries, because the resources are limited in the first place, and therefore even if you operate, you can assure that there's going to be equal distribution for both countries. What affirmative fails is to provide a tipping point that shifts all the incentive of South Korea to go with Japan. Next, on Japan saying sorry. If Japan already does this in the first place, like second affirmative suggests, then he shot them on their foot. Because it's likely that if Japan already does this without even pursuing a close tie, then we don't need the active pursuit in the first place if the president is going to be a good person. Therefore, by second F's analysis, the solution exists in status quo. I don't think it's important that we do this policy then. But even if you do not believe this, I know that South Korea already has a lot of alternatives that exist because they're rich and have a lot of tech, a lot of countries that wants to ties with them. So you can choose a lot of countries to get your resources from without compromising your policies, without harming your country. They already have a lot of military. And if North Korea is a problem, note that the US and countries who see North Korea is a problem is already supporting South Korea in the first place. But more than that, note that it's unlikely for North Korea to attack South Korea in the first place, precisely because, like second F said, wars are expensive. Countries wants to get rich. I don't see why they would create this context in the first place. North Korea is a global enemy, even without the ties of Japan. Japan will still keep them in check, insofar as Japan doesn't want instability in the region, which affects its stability anyway. I don't see why it's inherent within the motion. This issue just proves to you that it's unclear why the active pursuit is necessary. But moreover, we tell you the active pursuit should only happen when there is an equal ability to negotiate, which is absent in Japan and South Korea, precisely because, like said that Japan is rich and has resources, it's likely going to be used to coerce Korea more. But secondly, this is because affirmative never proved that Japan is a good actor in the first place. We posit to you that they're not, precisely because the premise of affirmative is that we have to do this to benefit our countries. Japan likely opts in to only use it as a leverage in order to get its self-interest. Opt never properly fulfills why it's necessary, and therefore it's likely the policy shouldn't be pursued in the first place. Second issue, is the pursuit in line with the priorities of South Korea? What are the priorities of South Korea now? I know that as a country, you often prioritize internal stability first before making any diplomatic and political ties internationally. This is important because this tells you that internal political climate and making it stable is a prerequisite for the pursuit of government in the first place. Precisely because if you pursue international relations and your domestic, when you have domestic instability, it's likely going to fail. There were two things that we said. First, that right now the chaebols are consolidating power and that they are continuously encroaching in South Korea. They tell us at second that, well, South Korea can prioritize multiple issues anyway because it's a country. Note that this response is very lazy because it ignores the scale and speed to which this encroachment happens. We tell you that this problem is urgent, precisely because right now Samsung and these monopolies have already captured a section of the political seats. They have already influenced policies and continuously consolidate power. Therefore, at a point in time that we shift political power and attention to Japan, it's likely that these chaebols will consolidate more power, especially because affirmative wants it to be a gradual process. Therefore, it's likely to do this in a long term, and therefore it likely needs a lot more attention. Therefore, by extension, you literally allocate a lot of resources to do this, and therefore you don't allocate the resources necessary to keep the chaebols in check. On affirmative, they grow so big at a point in time that we can no longer hold them accountable, even at best at the Japan ties happen. They say that, well, if you want to check monopolies, then we can just invite companies inside and they will compete with the monopolies. Note that this just literally ignores the power of chaebols that is already established within the country. They're likely to be outcompeted, even if at best that these Japanese companies come in. So even at best that the Japan ties succeed, South Korea still loses because the chaebols already control a majority of the political seats. Therefore, they're likely to take the ties that happens with Japan. It doesn't benefit benefit the majority of South Korean. It doesn't benefit the military. What they only benefit are the chaebols who are already rich and powerful in the first place. And this is because when they become a large unaccountable monopoly, people no longer have a choice what products they opt into, precisely because they become an unaccountable monopoly on their side. This is why government whip trying to say this is unimportant is wrong, because at a point in time that it becomes worse, we prove to you that it's likely to be very, very bad. Comparatively, because we're able to prioritize this large issue, we're likely to solve it better precisely because we can focus our resources to solve it. Note that this problem should be weighed in extent while solvency may or may not happen. What you have to weigh this to is a larger probability that it can, and opposition clearly proves that down the bench that we can. But secondly, we told you as well that there is a political dissonance between South Korea and Japan. Note that even at the point in time that the third issue is not as important, what you have to weigh this into is when we actively pursue it, it's likely that it's going to harm the country. Opposition affirmative never proved to us why it's an okay trade-off to have internal instability and pursue Japan.
I'd like to thank the negative for that speech and welcome negative reply to close neg.
Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, all of opposite or proposition case relies on a few key statements, right? 1, they did not respond to. 2, North Korea will X. 3, economic and political benefit. The best case coming from their side is that they solve hunger, poverty, corruption, a list of other benefits that they failed to prove direct and debate like SDG goals, etc. The worst case, apparently, on our side is that North Korea will nuke us and nobody will do anything about it. But I think they failed to understand that this was actually an actor debate, not a general. This house believes that it's in South Korea's interests, etc., etc. There are two standards that I want to apply: the word close and Japan. Firstly, on the word close, we told you that close probably means like an active pursuit of this policy, an active pursuit towards reaching a common consensus with Japan. We said that since it's an actor motion, and the actor is South Korea, it is South Korea who has to go out of their way to make this happen. That means that you have to divert a significant amount of your national resources and capital, as well as political incentives to make this happen, and make a lot of concessions to make Japan agree with you. What does that mean? It means at the point in which they don't conclusively respond to this, our analysis as to how you negotiate in bad faith and why you would normally not operate under such circumstances still stands. That is to say, propositions push to say that you cannot, you can do multiple things like India, is something that does not account for how the word close in this. The trade deals are good, and there is a general military benefit to pursuing this relationship. The bulk of the case with PM was that generally trade deals are good, right? Most of the nuancing was the DPM. I think this was strategically damaging and the desperate response to fix their case, insofar as they recognized that they forgot something, and that was they had to defend this from the perspective of South Korea doing this action. It was never conclusively proven why Japan was the best country to divert efforts in regards to economic benefit. It was never proven why Japan was the best country in regards to pursuing a military benefit. Insofar as WIP also wants to argue that it's fine if you want to do things more, yes, then why not maximize your efforts to go for the country that will provide you the most benefit? It is unclear why Japan is that country. This was an actor motion, by the way, if I hadn't mentioned that before. Proposition doesn't exactly give clear analysis trying to outline the interests of South Korea. They just say reparation and military good. Nothing done to show why South Korea is so damn bad that this policy was then told you. Why would they want to do this? Like I said, Diallo, their entire case hinges on Japan wanting to do this. But do the proposition do anything to prove this? No. They just assume that on this notion of symmetric benefit, that Japan will opt in and join the bandwagon. That because this policy is something that is economically good for both countries, because both these countries are technological powerhouses, that negotiation will go swimmingly, that negotiation will go in favor of South Korea. And in doing so, they will get SDGs and they will get reparations, and Japan will say sorry. But we also told you, Koreans and Japanese people hate each other on Converse. It's still standing because they just watched it. They still said, or they just said things as, oh, this thing does not matter insofar as the historical past is not relevant given proximate problems to South Korea like North. Again, I think North Korea's existence is also probably a historical example. So if they want to do that, then it's probably a contradictory bit of analysis to say North Korea is now just a more important problem because it's proximate. But then we gave you more proximate problems like chaebol being a dominant factor in the economic industry. So just weighing that in terms of actual proximity on proposition's own standard, right? We're probably winning because our promise exists within the country. Theirs exists another country away. Our proposition then says, oh, there's uniqueness to the benefit. WIP desperately tries to save their case here, right? They start trying to build, right, to try and justify their case. You can't credit it. In terms of the actual uniqueness of benefits, proposition does not have anything. In terms of nuancing to the actor, proposition barely does that. For all these reasons opposed.
I'd like to thank Ned Reply for that speech and welcome Af Reply to close this debate.
All right, 3, 2, 1. As an average reasonable voter, I want you to think about a few things. The only harms, and ridiculously only two which doesn't really matter in this debate, is one, internal issues, two, trauma. Notice two things here. One, they never prove to you or absolutely no motion. Like if you don't do this, you get to solve this. They don't mechanize this at all. But secondly, more importantly, they also never mechanize to you how both of these things become worse in their paradigm. What is their argument? One, internal issues. Their corruption gets worse, right? Multiple responses. Like the first thing the Soumitra says, every literal country has corruption, doesn't mean that they're not allowed to do trade deals with each other, right? You can work parallelly on both. Like imagine every single country who goes through the problem of corruption, who goes through the problem of companies which form oligopolies, and how exactly do they deal with them? Do they actually deal with them at a point of which they don't deal with any international relations, but rather just focus on internal issues? No, right? Because you have multiple people in the fucking government who can do this. Secondly, resources. Unsure why this takes resources, right? You do not need resources to hold diplomatic talks. You do not need resources to hold meets. You do not need resources to sign FTA agreements. Extremely unsure why that is likely to be a barrier. More importantly, trauma. Again, like the point is like they never say why this trauma gets worse or the idea against this ideas of apologies gets worse in their paradigm. Rather than not say that they will never like get an apology in their world. We tell you, and you have to weigh this in the propensity of likelihood. We tell you the moment you say and hold and like extend the arm to Japan, you say you increase the amount of proportion at a point of which you have negotiating power to talk with them. At a point of which you are necessarily friends or strategic allies, it allows you to talk about your past traumas, if that is the case. Right? At that point of time, you can ask for victim justice. That's the more propensity likelihood analysis of why that is so. But even if you don't buy this, let's weigh this out. Does past trauma or any sort of internal harms triumph the benefits we give you? The first thing which we tell, and note this is from the first speaker itself, about the economic benefits. The idea of two things. One, tragedy of commons, two, trade wars. This is necessarily what comes at Chesta at first staff, right? What does she tell you? What does Soumitra tells you? They tell you that the moment you start fighting with Japan, your most important ally, but more importantly, the only ally which is like working on technologies and so on, and create trade wars, it affects both of you. But more importantly, the tragedy of commons about both of you as well, because the restrictions disallows you to gain resources. Note one thing very crucially here is that this is symbiotic. The moment you do this, you're not only helping yourself, but helping Japan. And Japan economists are not dumb enough to not realize this. What this means that you necessarily do not have to concede a lot. But more importantly, they never tell you what these concessions generally look like, right? What exactly do you have to give up at a point of which you have to get a concession from Japan? But more importantly, what is the other argumentation here? That, hey, if you want economics and military, go to other allies. Again, like just disclaimer, at a point of which you deal with Japan doesn't mean that you have to break off ties with every single fucking country in the world, right? Which is say that you can make ties with other countries at a point of which you're making ties with Japan. You already have great ties with the United States of America. Extremely unsure why all of this is binary. These are magical binaries. As an average reasonable voter, you cannot credit those. But more importantly, the unique benefit in terms of military is that there's a common threat of North Korea and China, which both Korea and Japan necessarily face. Korea more so because they share a fucking border. But more importantly, China more so because they have an incentive to destabilize South Korea because of the fact that they are US allies, because of the fact that they necessarily compete them in the technological market. All of those reasons mean that you have to create more pool in terms of military resources, because Japan uniquely gives you nautical miles, which allows you to deal with Chinese submarines around the South China Sea. But more importantly, it gives you nuclear technology and advanced military equipment, which no other allies can probably give you. For all of those unique benefits, and for the harms which they never mechanize, for the harms which are just not a binary.
I'd like to thank all speakers for this debate. So I'll invite all speakers to cross the floor and shake hands. I guess I'll. Okay, thank you for this debate. So 3 parts in this OA. Firstly, general feedback. Secondly, on decision. And then thirdly, on justification. 2 pieces of general feedback. Number 1, teams should make sure they make arguments which are relevant to debate, because if you waste time on things which are unimpactful, it is unlikely to do you any favors. From side affirmative, I think this looks like claims pertaining to SDGs, because if you ally with each other, now we get more green technology and help things with climate change. I thought it was like, yeah, maybe true to some extent, but is, I think, relatively unimpactful for the reason that it is not really unique to this debate. I think the converse on side negative is the idea about chaebols is also one which is, I think, not necessarily super relevant, because I don't think you sufficiently explain why allying with Japan is going to have an opportunity cost, which results in not being friends with, not cracking down on chaebols or regulating them, which means I think there's a lot of airtime spent here, which was better used doing more responsive material. Secondly, I think both teams had a bit of an impacting problem, which is just to say you need to actually explain what harms occur and what they look like and why it matters to me as an adjudicator. It is often insufficient just to be like, I've got some economic benefits here. I think side affirmative could have gone way harder in explaining why having a common kind of fishing grounds means South Korean fishermen don't get pulled over by a large Japanese boat is actually quite important in allowing people to sustain their livelihoods, to be able to, conduct commerce, not living in fear, are all things which are relatively important and could have had dealt with more characterization. I think similarly for side negative, explaining why reigniting these past historical disputes and having your lived experiences be denied is quite horrible. It is quite traumatizing for people with these experiences or know people with these experiences, explaining why this is actually a huge wedge issue in South Korea, which makes an impact on this debate. So I guess more humanization of the impacts you want to talk about, make them more persuasive, and also make it seem more important to an adjudicator. In terms of decision then, we saw this debate in a 2-1 split, the trainee splitting against the majority, and saw it as a debate to side affirmative. So congratulations to side affirmative and commiserations to side negative. The first thing to begin with this justification is to explain side negative strategy in this debate. Side negative strategy is essentially to contest the marginal benefit South Korea gains by entering into a relationship with Japan, because they have pre-existing economic and military ties with other countries, which means they don't need it. Which means, I guess, the burden here for side affirmative is just to establish what are the unique benefits of allying with Japan. So we hear 2 things on side affirmative. The first of which is that it is better economically. And first affirmative gives a set of reasons about why labor exchange is good, why they can maximize trade, why they can share technology, why they can reduce things like resource conflicts. And I think uniquely, they also explain why this cooperation makes sense because of similar industries between both countries. Also, the fact that the current climate of investment is very favorable for South Korea, in particular with Japan having negative interest rates, and also the fact that they share a common sea. Negatives mitigation is to say, South Korea doesn't need this because they're already an economic powerhouse with many big tech companies. And I think at the point where it's like, yes, they are powerful, but I think this is still a unique benefit they can gain, which is still on net a benefit and one which cannot be defeated by that piece of mitigation. The second benefit then, which our side of firm to provide, is that it is very useful for protecting South Korea's security interests. And they give a few reasons about sharing military intel, sharing military strategy, the trade of military resources, and there was an increased imperative push at second affirmative about why the recent reignition of conflicts with missiles being fired over is something which is why we ought to care about this quite a lot. Neg's response is just to say, well, you're already allied with the United States, who is a big force. And the second is that Japan is not super useful because their military is small because of the constitutional requirements, which require them to have a smaller military. I agree that the second claim is probably true, that in terms of actual sharing of military resources, Japan probably is not that strong for this reason. But I think third affirmative explains, even in absence of being able to literally give people more weapons and stuff like that, they explain that things like geographic proximity is particularly important in deterring both Chinese and North Korean aggression, and that makes the relationship unique, which is to say, even though Singapore and Taiwan might be stronger in terms of a military capacity, because of geography, it is an alliance they want to act as a bulwark against these other 2 countries. And at the end, I did not believe it was a very big harm to strengthen this relationship. These are the reasons as to why I believe in the end, I think side affirmative gets to claim some sort of benefits pertaining to economics and some sort of benefits pertaining to security interests. This in and of itself is not enough to win side affirmative this debate because it has to be weighed off against the set of harms which side negative attempt to prove here. Side negative provides 3 harms. The first harm is this idea about an opportunity cost, which is that they can tackle more pressing political problems. This looks like the monopolistic force of the chaebol who advocate for things like deregulation and are corrupt. I thought the side affirmative beats this in 3 reasons. Firstly, second affirmative identifies correctly that countries can do many things. The amount of political capital used to deal with the chaebol is different from foreign affairs and are not mutually exclusive. The characterization from second negative about a close relationship necessarily requiring a diversion of resources from one aspect to another, I thought was unpersuasive for the very reason that a close relationship could necessitate having more trade relations, having more diplomatic channels, and doing more like military training exercises, which is not unique to a diversion of capital within the internal workings of South Korean governments, of which this is a claim which is made right from first affirmative. The second thing here is that even though Neg says I should care more about dealing with the chaebol, I think they insufficiently explain how they solve it with more resources, which is to say, side negative, they wanted to make this argument stick to prove their harm by internal stability, had to explain to me why the political will exists, had to explain to me how they're likely to do the crackdown, and also had to explain to me why this crackdown was likely to be successful, given the existing analysis about the hold the chaebol have both over the South Korean economy, but also politics. Means that even if I believe the claim at best, I do not believe that this rediversion of resources actually solves the problem you want to claim. The third thing here is I think second affirmative also gives a quite clever response that if you really want to solve it, clearly you should open up the market so Japan can enter in and their own tech companies, which weakens the monopolistic hold which the chaebols have over the economy. That's the reason as to why I think this harm is squarely unlikely to occur in this debate. The second harm, then, which side of negative give, is to go concessions need to be made, and that is likely to be bad for South Korea. And specifically, to discuss concessions when it comes to apologies over past historical disputes. I think for two kind of concerns here. The first is that I think this is a bit of a tension to the later claim that Japan won't reciprocate this relationship, because presumably, if it is a concessionary deal, it is in the interest of Japan to also form this relationship because they get a better side of the bargain. But secondly, I think that the mechanism from side negative is to say South Korea is the one moving forward with these negotiations and want the close tie, which means Japan has more leverage. And this might be the only mechanism, but I don't think affirmative actually sufficiently respond to it. So perhaps I believe that to some extent these deals are not going to be favorable. But specifically, the way in which they concretize why this deal is going to be unfavorable, I think was maybe a bit limited and was focused on the third harm, which is to say these historical disputes generate tensions. And they cite things about the refusal to acknowledge war crimes, the exploitation of comfort women, and historical revisionism in textbooks. The reasons as to why I think this does not stand are a fewfold. Ignoring all the assertions being thrown about was there an apology, was it not an apology, why is there enough passings done, I think I have to mitigate this in 3 ways. They explain, firstly, it was a long time ago. Secondly, they explain that countries often trade off these past tensions for mutual benefit, and there is an analogy given to how post-colonial nations engage with their colonizers. And the third thing to be said here is that at the worst, a closer relationship often invites dialogues, which allows for a possibility of overcoming this conflict. And note, whilst this mechanism exists, I think it was incredibly speculative, and that it was unclear to me as to whether these disputes were ever going to be resolved, but I saw it as maybe something which could happen. But I think the second and more important thing as to why this argument falls for side negative is to say it is under-impacted, which is to say there was a lack of explanation as to what happens when these disputes get re-inflamed in South Korean politics. How are people likely to respond? What are the internal tensions which are going to occur? And it's something which is so undesirable, we're willing to outweigh the security benefits as well as the economic benefits. And as a result, even though I believe it is maybe there, I think it is probably less important than material improvements in people's lives when you have a better economy, when you facilitate things like trade, and also when people feel more safe and secure when they're acting as when this alliance protects them in a better sense from the kind of aggressive forces of North Korea and China. So that is the reason as to why I saw this debate fell to side affirmative. I hope this made sense, and I think the panel had very good thoughts, so please don't hesitate to reach out to them for feedback. You can also message me on either Messenger or Discord. But before we close this kind of Zoom call or meeting, are there any questions?
No questions from affirmative. Thank you very much for your education.
Okay. Any questions from side negative?
We'll be reaching to you guys for feedback.
All right. Oh, good. Good luck with future rounds. I hope you enjoyed the tournament so far.